There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of a 1995 novel by a British writer named Elizabeth Berridge. Her last novel, and the title is Touch and Go. Her last novel, my first anything by Elizabeth Berridge, and based on how much I really loved this, I can't wait to read more by her. So let me tell you a little bit about what it's about. Our protagonist is Emma Rowlands, and she has recently left an abusive marriage, and she is in her maybe mid-40s. She has a teenage daughter who escaped the parental discord and is now doing her gap year in India and not keeping in touch with her mother nearly as much as her mother thinks she should. But her mother, Emma, our protagonist, has her own life to put back together. The novel opens with Emma returning from London, where she had been living for decades, to the Welsh village where she had grown up. It's not really clear whether either of her parents were Welsh. I don't think so in the story. The novelist, Elizabeth Berridge, had Welsh ancestry. I don't know if it was one grandparent or what it was, but she had Welsh ancestry, and this, in many ways, is a Welsh novel. Emma returns to the really small little village because the village doctor, who she remembers fondly from her childhood there, bequeathed her his big old dilapidated house in town that was also the surgery. And she is shocked, and it all goes back to some childhood conversation she had when she had to have her tonsils out. And as a result, he left her the house, and everybody thought it was a joke, but it wasn't a joke because all these years later, he has kicked the bucket and she has this house. And it came at the right time because she's in the process of closing down the London flat or house or whatever she has that she had lived in with her husband. Her daughters disappeared off to India, and Emma is an artist and is on the lip of making a new life for herself by returning home. This novel really came along at the right time in my life because I am scrambling to get ready to move back to Canada from after living in Tokyo for more than a dozen years. So I think that I fell so deeply into this novel because it came along at the right time in my life. In many ways, it's a quiet novel. I'd say it's a character-driven novel. And there are 3 generations of women that we meet in this novel. Emma, our protagonist, her mother. I'm not going to mention a bunch of names because I think that when I listen to book reviews and there's too many names in the review, I just start to tune out. Her mother, who has recently been widowed and can't stay home long enough to deal with her grief, so she just keeps traveling all over the world and globetrotting instead of dealing with whatever she has to deal with. And then this daughter, who we never actually, we barely meet her on the pages of the novel except through phone calls and as Emma, her mother, is worrying about her. And then there is a large cast of very colorful characters in the small town that Emma hasn't, maybe she's kept in touch with them a little bit over the years, but is getting reacquainted with. And some of them are really annoying and irritating, and some of them are really quite wonderful people for Emma to re-establish ties with, but all of them are quite colorful. And there is a lot about, in many ways, I think this could be considered a part of Welsh literature because there's a lot about Welsh folklore and history and geography and everything. And there's an awful lot about art. So if you're interested in art, there is much in this novel, including, my subscriber taught me a new word, ekphrasis, which is where you write about art or you paint a sculpture, but it's a interaction between 2 media, two modes of art making, and in this case, writing about art in fiction. And that was maybe my favorite part, because Emma's old friend comes over right away and helps her explore the old doctor's house, and it is just a huge house, and she has no idea what she's going to do to fill it up. She can have an art studio, and she's hoping her daughter will come to visit and her mother will come to visit, but it's a big, huge house. And her friend has all kinds of ideas, and one of the things, because it also includes the surgery, the doctor's clinic. And this was fairly early in the novel, and it was something that got me so excited and fascinated that I could barely sleep the night I read it. I was doing so much Googling and imagining about this. So let me give you a Reader's Digest condensed version of the fact that in the waiting room years ago, she and her friend both remembered this huge print of a woman with tattered gloves. And there's enough information in the acrostic piece of writing. It's mentioned, there's about 3 pages within that chapter about this painting, and it's called in the novel The Lady with Tattered Gloves by Nicholson. And when I Google it, I find a picture called The Girl with Tattered Gloves, which in many ways is exactly what's described in this chapter by Elizabeth Berridge, but there are really important differences. The title, I've put it up on the screen for you to look at while I'm talking. The facial expression, much is made by these two women about the woman's facial expression, but that also that her gloves are on the table beside her, and she's not wearing them like she is in the actual photo. But the main difference is that Emma has a strong memory of seeing the original painting years ago in a gallery and remembering that it used to hang in the doctor's office in her childhood, but just being struck by all the various things about sexism and misogyny that were so evident in the narrative of the painting. And much is made in her memory and her description of this painting that there is a man's back in the foreground of the picture that covers half the painting. And the woman, her expression is exactly like it is in the picture you're seeing, is looking off, not at him, but looking, out of the picture. And that man, the profile of the man's back, it's absolutely absent from the picture, and I have Googled the heck out of this to find, is the picture that I keep finding just a small part of the picture, and if you zoom out, is there a man's back? But no. So Berridge has taken some license with that just fascinates me. That leads into where Emma is in her life, and the fact that she herself is an artist, and her art goes through some really interesting evolutions as she starts to make a home and set up a new life for her back in this little Welsh village. One of the old family friends, one of the neighbors, sends over his hired man to help her sanding the floor and wallpapering or stripping or whatever, just household stuff. And that young man, maybe 20, 21, something like that, is really sexy. She's attracted to him. It's very subtly done, the way that we see this attraction, and she starts to paint pictures of him, and he's very friendly, and you have to read the book to find out what happens. But I just thought that was beautiful. There's a celebration of women's sexuality in general, but it was done with very subtle nuances that just made me kind of squirm and smile, and part of my smile was imagining what it would be like to have a young man like that around. That was very friendly, but even more of it was just a smile of feeling impressed with Elizabeth Berridge's light touch. So there's a lot about art, and there's a lot about making this house a home. And apparently Elizabeth Berridge her father was a real estate something, and her descriptions of the houses in her fictions, according to what I've read in the literary criticism, is one of the hallmarks of an Elizabeth Berridge story or novel. And certainly this house is one of the main characters in the story. The last thing I'll say is that the more that her mother comes into the story, the more you can understand stuff that happened way back when our protagonist was a child living in this village, that go into dark places in a way that I thought was just fascinating. And not all of the storylines in the novel end happily. Some of those endings may not work for everybody. There were a little bit too many storylines. Not all of them resolved satisfyingly. It felt a little bit cluttered is too strong of a word, but a little bit too crowded. Those are such small criticisms, but just for some of you that might mean a lot more to. If you love character-driven fiction about women at that stage of life in a moment of crisis, rebuilding their lives and finding a new sense of self, this was a real mini masterpiece. So let me close with the opening few paragraphs. It was not until the middle of October, with dusk curtaining the hills, that Emma at last arrived at the house she had so oddly inherited. The heavy gates had been latched back at the entrance to the drive, and she braked short of the house. The journey from London had tired her. She had stopped once only, in the Cotswolds, to eat a picnic lunch and feed the small pregnant cat curled up in the basket on the seat by her side. She had noticed changes in the village, the school gone and a garage in its place, the old chapel they had all run from as children, thought to be haunted, now razed to the ground, which had reclaimed its own space with overgrown laurels and fine burdocks glimpsed briefly as she drove slowly past. She noted other changes that marked her a stranger and mad to come back. What were these new houses doing on the slopes of what she had always called Doctor's Hill? Council built, with the slate roofs the Welsh went in for, they spread in slanting rows over the meadow below his house. Her house now. Here it was then, as she remembered. It had stood solid, red, and foursquare on top of the hill since the turn of the century, hence its name, Domengastel. An attic window under the roof, 3 windows along the front, and one on either side of the front door, like a child's painting. Tall trees, sycamore and chestnut, loomed about it. Smoke from the chimney, and the windows lighted. The window on the right, though, almost obscured, tight in the dense green clasp of an overgrown holly bush. That would have to come down, for a start. As she edged slowly up to the front door, she realized that she was already thinking like a house owner. Taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, she stepped out of the car to silence and the smell of frost. This is a novel about being on the cusp, looking back, looking forward, and with those 2 gazes, forwards and backwards, Elizabeth Berridge has written a novel that made me smile, challenged some of my thinking about the lives of women, renewed my faith in the power of reinvention for us all, and made a wonderfully complicated fictional statement about going home. Thanks for watching.